August 25, 1944. Cherbourg Harbor, Normandy, France. The wrench slipped from Sergeant William Henderson's grease-streaked hands as he gazed at the endless convoy forming before him. The British claimed these trucks would fail. They insisted the design was flawed, underpowered, and unsuitable for modern combat. Now Henderson watched as 6,000 of them prepared to attempt the impossible, supplying General Patton's racing Third Army across 400 miles of devastated French terrain. The letters GMC stamped on the hood stood for General Motors Corporation. But to the 75% African American drivers climbing into those cabs, already exhausted before their journey even began, those letters meant something else entirely. They meant survival. They meant the difference between triumph and defeat. They meant the lifeline that would keep Allied forces advancing toward Germany. What none of them realized that August morning was that this truck, dismissed by British military experts just 4 years earlier, would prove more valuable than tanks, more vital than fighters, more essential than any other weapon system in the European theater. The modest 2.5-ton GMC CCKW, the Jimmy, the Deuce and a Half, was about to cement its place in history as the backbone of the most critical supply operation the world had ever witnessed. The story began not in the chaos of battle, but in the quiet design rooms of General Motors in 1939. The United States Army Ordnance Corps had issued specifications for a new medium tactical truck. They required a 2.5-ton load-rated vehicle with 6-wheel drive capability, able to operate off-road in any conditions. The requirement seemed straightforward, but the solution proved anything but. General Motors Truck and Coach Division, operating from their Pontiac, Michigan facility, approached the problem by adapting commercial truck components. They modified their existing Axe series truck design with key changes: a second rear axle for improved traction and load distribution, full all-wheel drive for off-road mobility, and reinforced frame rails to handle military loads. The prototype was designated ACKWX353, the precursor to the future CCKW. The original design used a GMC 248 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine producing just 77 horsepower. The trucks weighed 9,856 pounds empty and measured 264 inches long, 94.5 inches wide, and 118 inches tall. By civilian standards, they were sufficient. By military standards, they were questionable. France placed an order for 1,000 of these experimental 6x6 trucks in late 1939. Production began at Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company's plants. The trucks featured enclosed steel cabs, fixed bedsides, troop seats, and conventional styling that would not have looked out of place on civilian construction sites. Essentially, they were commercial trucks in military guise. Then came the disaster that changed everything. German Panzer Division smashed through the Ardennes forest in May 1940, bypassing the Maginot Line and advancing deep into France. The French army, despite possessing some of Europe's most advanced tanks and fortifications, collapsed under the speed and coordination of German combined arms operations. The British Expeditionary Force retreated to Dunkirk. France fell in 6 weeks. 2,000 of the ACKWX trucks had already been delivered to France. They were captured by German forces and ironically served the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, where German soldiers grudgingly acknowledged their dependability. The remaining orders, along with trucks still in production, were redirected to Great Britain under emergency wartime contracts. The British Army took delivery of the ACKWX trucks in the summer of 1940 and immediately subjected them to rigorous evaluation. British military inspectors were unimpressed. Their reports, preserved in archives, were critical. The wheelbase was too long for European roads and trails, maneuvering was difficult, the 77-horsepower engine was underpowered when fully loaded, acceleration was sluggish, hill climbing was marginal, and the truck struggled in mud and soft terrain despite 6-wheel drive. British officials concluded the ACKWX was unsuitable for modern mechanized combat and fundamentally flawed. Rather than risk soldiers' lives with the inadequate trucks, the War Office diverted roughly 1,000 units to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease in 1941. A total of 2,466 ACKWX trucks were produced across all recipients. The British rejection seemed to confirm fears that American truck manufacturers, used to broad highways and gentle terrain, could not produce vehicles fit for European warfare. General Motors engineers, stung by the critique, returned to their drawing boards. The lessons were clear: more power was required, the chassis needed refinement, and wheelbase options had to accommodate different missions. But the core concept, a 6x6 medium tactical truck built from commercial parts for rapid mass production, remained sound. American engineers recognized something their British counterparts had overlooked. This was not about creating the perfect truck, but producing adequate trucks in overwhelming numbers through sheer industrial capacity. In 1941, General Motors introduced the redesigned version, the CCKW. The designation followed GMC's internal coding system, C for 1941 design, second C for conventional cab, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual tandem rear axles. Improvements over the ACKWX were significant, though not revolutionary. The new GMC 270 cubic-inch inline six-cylinder engine replaced the 248, generating 104 horsepower at 2,750 revolutions per minute. A 27 horsepower increase might seem modest, but it transformed the truck's capabilities. The engine produced 216 ft-lbs of torque at 1,400 revolutions per minute, delivering the low-end power essential for heavy loads and steep grades. Two wheelbase options were designed, the CCKW 352 with 145-inch wheelbase for short variant duties like artillery towing, and the CCKW 353 with 164-inch wheelbase as the standard cargo version. This versatility allowed one basic truck to fulfill multiple roles across diverse combat units. The frame used a conventional ladder design with riveted crossmembers, simple to manufacture and repair. 3 beam axles, all powered, provided 6x6 mobility. The front axle used leaf springs. The rear tandem employed leaf springs with locating arms to control axle movement. Brakes were hydraulic with vacuum assist, a major improvement over older mechanical systems. Tires were 7.50 to 20, offering adequate ground clearance and payload capacity. Early production models retained the enclosed metal cab from the ACKWX design. But as wartime production accelerated and steel became a ration resource, GMC engineers made a decisive change. Beginning in July 1943, new CCKW trucks featured open cabs with canvas tops and removable doors. This modification saved roughly 150 pounds of steel per vehicle. Multiplied across hundreds of thousands of trucks, the savings could produce dozens of destroyers or hundreds of tanks. The cargo bed also evolved due to material constraints. Early all-steel beds proved heavy, wooden beds warped and cracked under combat loads. A hybrid design with steel framing and wooden slats still fell short. The final design returned to simplified all-steel construction, minimizing material waste while ensuring durability. The result was a truck that emphasized simplicity, reliability, and ease of mass production over raw performance. The CCKW would never win races. It would never impress engineers with sophisticated technology, but it could be built in enormous numbers by semi-skilled workers using available materials, and it could be repaired in field conditions by mechanics with basic tools and limited training. General Motors placed the primary production contract with their yellow truck and coach facility in Pontiac, Michigan. As orders multiplied, Chevrolet's St. Louis, Missouri plant joined production. At peak output, these two facilities were completing one CCKW truck every 7 minutes, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. The assembly lines never stopped. The manufacturing process itself represented American industrial might. Raw materials entered one end of the Pontiac plant and finished trucks rolled out the other. Sheet metal was stamped into body panels, frames were welded and riveted, engines were assembled from hundreds of precision components. Transmissions, axles, and suspension systems were built in separate facilities and shipped to final assembly. The entire operation employed tens of thousands of workers, many of them women, who had entered the workforce to replace men serving in combat. Production numbers tell the story of American industrial mobilization. From 1941 through 1945, General Motors manufactured approximately 562,750 CCKW trucks across all variants. This figure includes specialized versions but represents standard production models, excluding cab-over-engine variants and non-all-wheel drive models. Standard CCKW production totaled approximately 518,000 to 519,000 units. To put this in perspective, Germany produced approximately 100,000 total trucks of all types during the same period. The Soviet Union, despite massive American Lend-Lease aid, manufactured fewer than 200,000 trucks. Great Britain's entire wartime truck production was dwarfed by this single American model. The CCKW alone nearly equaled the combined truck production of all Axis powers. The CCKW spawned dozens of specialized variants: dump trucks for engineer units, tankers for fuel and water transport, mobile workshops equipped with lathes and welding equipment, communications vans, housing, radio equipment, ambulances with medical supplies and stretcher racks, wrecker trucks with cranes for recovering disabled vehicles, anti-aircraft platforms mounting quadruple 50 caliber machine variant used the same basic chassis, engine, and drivetrain, simplifying maintenance and spare parts logistics. But numbers mean nothing without application. And in June 1944, the CCKW faced its greatest test. The test would not come from German anti-tank guns or Luftwaffe bombers. It would come from simple physics, from the tyranny of distance, and the mathematics of supply. June 6, 1944. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on 5 Normandy beaches. The largest amphibious invasion in history achieved tactical surprise and established a lodgment on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. But lodgment is not victory. By mid-July, more than 1 million Allied troops were crammed into a pocket approximately 50 miles wide and 20 m deep. They were going nowhere. The Germans had turned Normandy into a defensive nightmare. Ancient hedge, thick walls of earth and vegetation dating back centuries divided the landscape into thousands of small fields. Each hedgerow was a ready-made defensive position. Each field became a separate battle. American infantry and armor bled through this bocage country at horrific cost, gaining yards instead of miles. Then came Operation Cobra. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched a massive breakout attempt supported by saturation bombing. Within days, German defensive lines cracked. American armored divisions poured through the breach. By early August, General George Patton's Third Army was racing across open French countryside, covering 50, 60, sometimes 80 m per day. The advance threatened to trap and destroy entire German armies. But Patton's tankers soon faced an enemy more dangerous than any panzer division. They were running out of fuel. Each Sherman tank consumed approximately 150 gal of gasoline per 100 m of travel. Armored division with approximately 250 tanks burned through massive quantities during rapid advance. Add trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles, and fuel consumption reached staggering levels. Patton commanded multiple divisions spread across hundreds of miles of front. His fuel requirements alone exceeded 400,000 gallons daily. First Army needed similar amounts. British and Canadian forces required their own supply lines. Total Allied fuel consumption in early August 1944 exceeded 3 million gallons per day. The Allies had planned for rapid advance. They had prepared supply depots and established logistics networks, but nobody had anticipated breakthrough this dramatic. Within 2 weeks of the Cobra breakout, American spearheads were 200 m from the Normandy beaches. Within a month, lead elements approached 350 miles from their supply bases. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every can of rations had to travel that distance over war-damaged roads through a French transportation network that Allied bombing had systematically destroyed in the months before D-Day. The destruction of French railroads had been deliberate. To prevent German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches, Allied air forces had spent April, May, and June 1944 systematically bombing every railroad yard, bridge, and marshalling center within 200 m of Normandy. The campaign succeeded brilliantly. German panzer divisions took weeks to reach the front instead of days. But those same bombed railroads could not now supply Allied armies racing toward Germany. The Mulberry harbors, those incredible artificial ports towed across the English Channel, had sustained the invasion force through June and July, but a massive storm in mid-June had destroyed the American Mulberry. The British Mulberry at Aramanes remained operational, but could not handle the tonnage requirements of 2 entire army groups. Cherbourg had been captured, but its port facilities were so thoroughly demolished by German engineers that restoration would take months. In late August 1944, American commanders faced catastrophe. Patton's tanks were running dry 300 m from their supply bases. First Army was rationing ammunition. Combat effectiveness hung by a thread. Without
immediate massive resupply, the Allied advance would stall.
German forces would gain time to consolidate new defensive lines. The opportunity to end the war in 1944 would be lost. On August 21, 1944, American logistics officers held an emergency planning conference. 36 hours of non-stop meetings produced a solution, so desperate, so audacious that it could only have been conceived by Americans raised on transcontinental highways and massive trucking networks.
They would create a dedicated express convoy system, similar to priority freight
trains. Every available truck would be pressed into continuous service. 2. One-way routes would be established from Normandy to forward supply points. All civilian traffic would be banned. Military police would control every intersection to ensure convoys never stopped. The plan required more trucks than any single command possessed. Within hours, logistics officers began stripping trucks from every non-critical unit in the European theater. Artillery battalions gave up their prime movers. Engineer units surrendered construction equipment haulers. Medical companies released ambulances. Infantry divisions lost their organic transportation. Every truck capable of rolling became part of the operation. The primary vehicle was the GMC CCKW.
By August 1944, tens of thousands of these trucks had been shipped to Europe.
They sat in motor pools, parked at supply depots, scattered across the rear areas. Now,
they were marshaled for the greatest truck convoy in history.
6,000 vehicles were assembled. Later that number would peak at nearly 6,000 trucks actually on the road simultaneously.
But trucks need drivers, and here, American racism created both crisis and opportunity.
The United States Army in
1944 remained strictly segregated.
African American soldiers served in separate units under predominantly white officers. Military policy based on racist
assumptions held that black soldiers lacked the intelligence and courage for combat roles.
Therefore, African Amines were assigned primarily to service units, quartermaster companies, port battalions, transportation units, truck drivers. In August 1944, the European theater contained approximately 210,000 African American soldiers.
Nearly half, about 93,000, served in the
Quartermaster Corps. When the call went out for truck drivers, these men answered not because they wanted to drive trucks for 60 hours straight,
not because they enjoyed being segregated and discriminated against
while fighting for freedom abroad. They answered because their country needed them, because combat troops depended on them,
because African American soldiers understood that serving with distinction advanced the cause of civil rights at
home. 17,000 African American soldiers became Red Ball Express drivers. 3,000 additional white soldiers joined them, though in practice the operation remained largely segregated with black and white units running separate convoys.
The drivers ranged in age from 18 to 40, though most were under 24.
Many had never driven a truck before military service.
Some came from urban areas where nobody owned cars.
They
received hasty training, sometimes just days, before being declared qualified to drive 2-in-1/2-ton military trucks loaded with 5 tons of cargo through combat zones.
The African American soldiers who became Red Ball Express drivers came from every corner of the United States. Farm boys from Mississippi who had driven tractors but never trucks. Factory workers from Detroit who knew assembly lines but not military logistics. College students whose educations were interrupted by the draft. Sharecroppers' sons seeking better opportunities than the Jim Crow South offered. Men who had
faced discrimination their entire lives now found themselves entrusted with the most critical supply mission of the war.
The Red Bull Express began operation on August 25, 1944.
The name came from railroad terminology dating to the late 1800s.
Railroad companies marked priority
express freight cars with red balls signaling all other traffic to yield right-of-way. Now red balls appeared on
signs marking dedicated truck routes across France. Red balls were painted on truck hoods identifying convoy vehicles. Red Ball Express. The system was brilliantly simple. 2 parallel one-way routes connected Normandy ports to forward supply depots.
The northern route carried loaded trucks toward the
Front, the southern route returned empty trucks to Normandy, often carrying German prisoners westward as backhaul. Cargo, total route length eventually stretched nearly 400 m as the front. Moved east, convoys officially consisted of at least 5 trucks with jeep escorts front and rear. Trucks were
ordered to maintain 60-yard intervals and 25 miles per hour maximum speed.
In reality,
individual trucks often departed as soon as they were loaded without waiting for convoy formation.
Speed limits became suggestions rather than rules. Drivers removed or disabled engine governors,
pushing the CCKW trucks well past their designed 56 miles per hour maximum.
Some veterans reported speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour, a terrifying velocity in a 2.5-ton truck with 1940s suspension and brakes.
The 793rd Military Police Battalion provided
route security and traffic control. MPs manned every major intersection, ensuring Red Bull convoys never stopped for cross-traffic.
They directed lost drivers, reported accidents, and fought a losing battle against speed limit violations.
Some MPs took to riding with convoys
when their jeeps proved too slow to keep up with speeding trucks.
Each round trip
took approximately 54 hours as the front moved farther east.
2-man driver teams
shared duties, though in practice both men often stayed awake for entire runs.
The trucks carried everything forward: 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline, ammunition in wooden crates, food,
rations in cardboard boxes, medical supplies, spare parts, mail from home, and occasionally unofficial cargo, including black market items and personal packages.
Loading operations at
Cherbourg and other Normandy ports ran 24 hours daily.
Steaders, many of them also African American, worked with brutal efficiency. A CCKW could be loaded with 5 tons of cargo in under 10 minutes. Drivers signed for their loads, received route instructions, and rolled toward the front.
No rest stops, no delays.
Keep them rolling. The journey itself was an ordeal that would break modern safety regulations in 100 ways. Drivers operated in blackout conditions at night using tiny cat-eye blackout lights that provided almost no illumination. They navigated by memory by following the truck ahead by sheer instinct. Roads were often cratered from bombing or shelling. Bridges were damaged. Detours were unmarked. Getting lost meant burning precious fuel and delaying critical supplies. German air attacks, though increasingly rare by late summer 1944, remained a threat. The Luftwaffe could still mount occasional raids, and a convoy of trucks made a tempting target. Drivers learned to watch the sky, to listen for the distinctive sound of German engines, to scatter off roads when air raid warnings sounded. Some trucks mounted 50 caliber machine guns on ring mounts above the passenger seat. These provided reassurance more than effective defense. Landmines posed a constant danger. German forces planted mines in road shoulders and likely parking areas.
Some were sophisticated triggered devices.
Others were crude, buried shells or captured munitions wired to detonate under vehicle weight. Red Bull drivers
learned to stay on pavement, to park only in cleared areas, to watch for disturbed earth or suspicious objects.
Fatigue was the greatest enemy.
Men pushed themselves past human limits,
sustained by coffee and determination. Some drivers took Benzedrine tablets,
amphetamines issued by medical officers to combat exhaustion, though this practice was officially discouraged.
The drugs kept men awake but impaired judgment, leading to accidents. Many drivers relied instead on strong
coffee, cigarettes, and sheer willpower to stay alert during marathon runs.
Accidents became common.
Trucks collided, overturned, or crashed into
obstacles. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel despite their best efforts. Vehicles ran off roads in darkness. Some accidents proved fatal. The Army
assigned relief drivers to ride in passenger seats, taking over when primary drivers could no longer function
safely.
Even so, exhaustion took its toll.
The trucks themselves suffered terribly.
The CCKW was designed for military use, but continuous operation.
Without proper maintenance exceeded any design specification. Engines overheated in summer heat while hauling maximum loads at high speed. Transmissions failed under abuse.
Clutches burned out.
Brakes wore through pads in days instead of months. tires subjected to overloading and high speeds
on rough roads failed with alarming frequency. Maintenance was performed under impossible conditions.
Mechanics
worked beside roads, in fields, under tarps strung between trucks.
They had basic tools and whatever spare parts could be scred.
Many repairs were field expedient, good enough to get the truck moving again, not proper rebuilds.
Oil changes were skipped. Scheduled maintenance was ignored.
Everything was sacrificed to keep trucks rolling.
Mechanics became masters of improvisation.
They fashioned gaskets from scavenged materials.
They bypassed
broken components with jewelry-rigged solutions. They cannibalized parts from
one truck to repair another. The CCKW's simple design made this possible. A mechanic with basic skills could diagnose problems, identify needed parts, and perform repairs using
whatever materials were available. This adaptability, born of desperate necessity, proved one of the truck's
greatest strengths.
By late August, broken trucks littered the Red Ball routes.
Some estimates suggest over 80 vehicles were simply abandoned when they could not be quickly repaired.
Drivers took what parts they could carry and hitched rides on passing convoys.
Wrecker trucks worked continuously to
recover disabled vehicles, but often they too broke down under the strain.
At
one point, nearly 30% of Red Bull trucks had significant mechanical problems that should have removed them from service.
But they kept rolling anyway because the alternative was unthinkable.
Yet, the operation succeeded beyond all
projections.
Within 5 days of starting, the Red Bull Express hit peak capacity. On August 29, 1944, 132 truck companies operating 5,958 vehicles delivered 12,342 tons of supplies to forward depots.
This single-day performance exceeded every pre-war estimate of what was logistically possible. The numbers continued to climb.
Daily deliveries averaged between 10,000 and 12,500 tons.
900 trucks were on the road at any given moment. Over 82 days of operation, Red Bull Express drivers hauled 412,193 tons of supplies across France.
They drove 121 million ton miles, a figure representing the tonnage multiplied by
distance. They kept multiple army groups supplied during the most rapid advance in military history. Private James
Ruckert of the 514th Quartermaster Regiment later recalled the experience. "We hauled anything General Patton needed.
Gasoline, ammunition, food, medical supplies. We took it all the way to the front lines, back and forth, back and forth. Some drivers ran into ambushes.
My company was lucky, but there was shooting all around us. We had to watch for V1 buzz bombs. They would fly over and then drop like regular bombs.
My
worst memories were seeing trucks get blown up and being afraid I might get killed.
But when General Patton said, 'Be there,' you were there, even if you had to drive all day and all night." Ruckert's testimony captured the reality of Red Bull operations. The constant fear, the exhaustion that made every mile feel like 10, the pride in knowing their work mattered, the determination to get through no matter what.
His company made the run from Cherbourg to Forward Depot dozens of times during the
operation's 82 days.
They lost trucks to accidents, mechanical failures, and
occasional enemy action, but they never failed to deliver their cargo.
Corporal Washington Rector of the 3916 Quartermaster Truck Company described
the racial dynamics. "You accepted discrimination.
We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise.
Some white drivers would try to prevent black drivers from passing their
convoys, creating dangerous road conditions, but most white combat troops
appreciated us.
They knew we were risking our lives to get them what they needed."
Rector's account revealed the complex racial tensions that existed within the Red Bull Express itself. Black and white units often operated separately.
When they did interact, discrimination sometimes manifested in petty ways.
White MPs might stop black drivers more frequently. White mess facilities might serve black drivers last.
White drivers might refuse to help
black drivers with mechanical problems.
Yet on the roads, when German shells fell, or when a truck broke down, far
from help, race often mattered less than survival. Black and white drivers
sometimes helped each other despite official segregation policies.
The trucks themselves became legendary among Drivers. The CCKW could take incredible abuse. You could overload them, speed them, skip maintenance, and they kept running. Sure, they broke down a lot. The transmissions were weak, the brakes wore out fast, but you could fix them with basic tools. That's what mattered. A complicated truck that needed a factory to repair would have been useless. The Jimmy was simple. Simple meant it worked. Drivers developed deep familiarity with their trucks. They learned the sound of every component, recognizing when something was about to fail. They knew how hard they could push before risking catastrophic breakdown. They understood which problems could be ignored temporarily and which required immediate attention. This intimate knowledge came
from spending days and nights behind the wheel, from performing their own repairs, from pushing the vehicles to their absolute limits and beyond. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express was delivering supplies to depots 350 miles from Normandy. The logistics became increasingly complex. Longer distances meant lower daily tonnage per truck. More trucks broke down from extended operation. Driver fatigue became critical. The French railroad system, which Allied engineers worked frantically to repair, remained largely inoperative. New ports, especially Antwerp and Belgium, were still in German hands or too damaged to use. The strain showed in every aspect of the operation. Accident rates climbed. Some convoys were ambushed by bypassed German units still fighting in isolated pockets. Theft became a problem as valuable cargo disappeared from trucks parked at rest stops. Gasoline, cigarettes, and food rations found their way onto black markets in liberated French cities. Some stolen goods appeared on black markets in Paris and other cities. Drivers and cargo handlers faced accusations, often unfounded, contributing to racial tensions. Military police investigated numerous incidents, but rarely recovered stolen materials. Yet, the trucks kept rolling because the alternative was unthinkable. General Patton's Third Army, the spearhead of the Allied advance, consumed supplies faster than any military formation in history. His tankers were engaged in nearly continuous combat, expending ammunition at rates that shocked supply officers. Each tank engagement could burn through a full combat load, requiring immediate resupply. Patton's aggressive tactics generated results, destroyed German divisions, and captured territory, but only because the Red Ball Express kept his forces fueled and armed. Patton himself recognized the operation's importance. Though famous for bold armored tactics, he understood that logistics enabled everything. His tanks were worthless without fuel, his artillery silent without shells, his infantry ineffective without food and ammunition. The Red Ball Express made his rapid advance possible. Without it, Third Army would have ground to a halt within weeks of the breakout, giving German forces time to establish new defensive lines that might have prolonged the war for months or years. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied commander, recognized the operation's importance. In an October message to Red Ball Express personnel, he wrote, "To you drivers and mechanics and your officers who keep the Red Ball vehicles constantly moving, I wish to express my deep appreciation. You are doing an excellent job." Eisenhower understood military logistics better than most commanders. His experience planning Operation Torch in North Africa had taught him that supply determined what operations were possible. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome logistical failure. The Red Ball Express represented logistics at its most basic and essential. Trucks, drivers, roads. Nothing sophisticated, nothing glamorous, but absolutely vital. Eisenhower's public recognition of the driver's contribution was unusual for the era and reflected his genuine appreciation for unglamorous but critical work. The contrast with German logistics was stark and telling. The Wehrmacht, despite its reputation as a modern mechanized force, relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. Germany employed more than 2.8 million horses during World War II to move supplies and equipment. German truck production was limited by steel shortages, fuel constraints, and manufacturing capacity devoted to weapons. When German mechanized units advanced, they frequently outran their logistics, a problem that contributed to defeats in
Russia and North Africa. German forces in France in 1944 faced logistical nightmare.
Allied air superiority made daylight movement nearly impossible. French resistance sabotaged rail lines and ambushed supply convoys. The Wehrmacht's horse-drawn supply system, sufficient for static defensive operations, could not sustain mobile warfare. German units frequently faced ammunition shortages, meager food supplies, and persistent fuel deficits. Captured German soldiers reported to interrogators that American logistical superiority was as disheartening as their firepower dominance. By mid-November 1944, the strategic situation had shifted enough to allow the Red Ball Express to stand down. Antwerp's port facilities were finally cleared of German demolitions and reopened to Allied shipping. The shortened supply route from Antwerp to the front cut trucking distances drastically. French railways, repaired by American and British engineers, began functioning on limited schedules. Portable gasoline pipelines installed across France started delivering fuel directly to forward depots. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express formally ended operations after 82 days. The drivers, many more exhausted than they had ever been, returned to their original units. Some joined other supply operations, while others were transferred to combat roles as the Army, desperate for infantry replacements, began accepting African American volunteers for frontline service. The final statistics told a story of achievement that military planners still study. 412,193 tons delivered, 6,000 trucks at peak operation, 23,000 drivers and support personnel, 75% African American, averaging 900 vehicles on the road simultaneously. Distances span up to 400 miles one way, operating non-stop for 82 days. But the true story was the truck. The GMC CCKW, dismissed by British experts as inadequate, proved itself the most essential tactical vehicle of World War II. Its simplicity, the very trait that seemed like a weakness, was its greatest asset. Drivers could repair CCKWs with basic tools. Mechanics could keep them running with improvised parts. The trucks could be overloaded, abused, and neglected. Yet, they kept functioning. The CCKW's reliability under strain became legendary. Stories circulated of trucks running with cracked engine blocks held together by wire and determination. Of transmissions that should have failed still shifting gears through sheer mechanical resilience. Of trucks that arrived at depots with flat tires, overheated engines, and failing brakes, delivered their loads, were hastily repaired, and returned to duty hours later. The truck's simple, sturdy design allowed even badly damaged vehicles to often reach their destinations. General Patton asserted flatly that the 2.5-ton truck was our most valuable weapon. He understood what many civilians did not: without supply, armies become mobs. Tanks without fuel are useless. Rifles without ammunition are clubs. Even the most advanced weapons are ineffective if they cannot be sustained. The humble CCKW truck made modern mechanized warfare possible by solving the unglamorous problem of moving supplies. Colonel John Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son and a veteran logistics officer, wrote after the war that without the Red Ball truck drivers, the advance across France could not have succeeded. The trucks, specifically the GMC CCKW, allowed American forces to maintain momentum when any pause would have let German defenses consolidate. The war might have extended into 1946 without this logistical achievement. In December 1944, the concept faced its ultimate test. German forces launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes Offensive, commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last major push in the West caught American forces off guard, creating a perilous bulge in Allied lines. Rapid reinforcement and resupply were critical. The Red Ball Express had ended, but the trucks remained, and so did the drivers. Reorganized under new names, including the Little Red Ball and White Ball Express, convoy operations resumed. The same GMC CCKWs that had supported Patton's advance now rushed reinforcements to contain the German breakthrough. The same African American drivers who had proven themselves in summer returned to roads in harsh winter conditions that made August's challenges seem mild. Snow and ice covered French and Belgian roads. Night driving became even more hazardous. German airstrikes increased as the Luftwaffe threw its reserves into the offensive. Yet the trucks pressed on. Ammunition reached besieged American units. Fuel kept tanks and trucks operational. Reinforcements arrived to stabilize the bulge. Combat troops fought desperately, but the supply convoys ensured they could continue. Winter operations introduced new hazards. Engines froze overnight and had to be thawed before starting. Icy roads nullified speed limits as trucks slid regardless of driver skill. Snow drifts blocked routes, demanding hours of digging to clear paths. Frostbite threatened drivers in open cab trucks with minimal heat. Yet the convoys pressed on, proving that the logistical system developed during the Red Ball Express could adapt to any conditions.
After Germany surrendered in May 1945, the CCKWs continued serving. Trucks that had crossed France now occupied Germany.
They transported displaced civilians to refugee camps, delivered food to starving populations, and moved occupation troops across the defeated Reich. Some were sent to the Pacific Theater, serving in the Philippines and Okinawa campaigns.
Production continued until 1945. By the war's end, General Motors had built more CCKWs than Germany produced vehicles of all types combined.
Total output, approximately 562,750 units, exceeded the pre-war truck inventory of most nations.
These trucks supplied not just America but Allied forces worldwide through Lend-Lease.
British, French, Soviet, and Canadian armies all operated GMC CCKWs.
The truck's simplicity translated to remarkable durability. CCKWs remained in active U.S. service through the 1960s.
The design was replaced by the M35 series trucks in the 1950s, but older CCKWs continued in National Guard and Reserve units for years. Many were sold as surplus to foreign militaries, serving into the 1970s and 80s.
Some are still operational today in the hands of collectors and museums.
The Red Ball Express drivers, especially the African American majority, received recognition slowly and incompletely. The operation was publicized during the war, featured in newsreels and magazines, but racial dimensions were often downplayed or ignored for segregated American audiences. The 1952 film Red Ball Express, while acknowledging African American participation, was modified at Department of Defense insistence to depict racial integration that did not exist in 1944.
Many veterans returned to a still segregated America.
Men who risked their lives supplying the fight against fascism faced discrimination in housing, employment, and civil rights. Some accessed GI Bill benefits for education and home loans, though often with more difficulty than white veterans.
Banks denied loans. Universities imposed quotas. Employers favored white applicants.
Others had their military service ignored or dismissed.
Yet the story endured. In the 1980s and 1990s, historians began fuller accounts of Red Ball Express operations.
Veteran testimonies were recorded and preserved. Museums created exhibits documenting the convoy system and the soldiers who made it work.
The National World War II Museum in New Orleans features restored GMC CCKWs and personal accounts from drivers.
James Rookard, of the 514th Quartermaster Regiment, told reporters years later, "I'm proud I served.
We were young.
We were scared, but we did what needed doing.
Many didn't think black soldiers could handle responsibility. We proved them wrong.
Every supply run that reached the front on time, that was us proving we deserved respect.
That was us fighting for freedom, foreign and domestic."
Rookard's words capture the dual consciousness of African American World War II veterans. They fought for American victory while knowing the nation denied them full citizenship. They risked their lives for a country that segregated them, discriminated against them, and often refused to acknowledge their contributions. Yet they served with distinction, understanding that their performance under fire advanced the broader civil rights struggle. The Red Ball Express became another chapter in the long story of African Americans proving their worth to a skeptical nation.
Technical lessons from Red Ball Express operations influenced U.S. military logistics for decades.
Continuous supply convoys, dedicated routes with priority traffic management, and massive trucking operations became standard doctrine. During the Korean War, similar convoy systems supplied United Nations forces in Vietnam.
Despite differences in terrain and tactics, truck convoys remained crucial. Modern military logistics continues to study Red Ball Express planning and execution. The GMC CCKW design influenced post-war truck development globally. Its 6x6 configuration became standard for medium tactical trucks.
The concept of mass-produced, easily maintained vehicles rather than specialized designs became widely adopted.
Countries worldwide copied or adapted CCKW features. Soviet designers, receiving thousands through Lend-Lease, studied them carefully. Post-war Soviet trucks, including the ZIL series, reflected clear CCKW influence.
The Soviets recognized that the CCKW's greatest feature was not any single specification, but the combination of adequate performance, simple maintenance, and massive availability. Modern military vehicles are far more sophisticated than the CCKW, with computers, automatic transmissions, central tire inflation systems, and armor. Yet they still face the same fundamental challenge: moving supplies reliably under combat conditions while remaining maintainable. Every military truck designer since 1945 has worked in the shadow of the CCKW, striving to match its blend of capability and simplicity. The CCKW proved that excellence in military equipment is not always about the best specifications. The British were correct that the ACKWX was underpowered and awkward, but wrong about what mattered. In total war, adequate vehicles produced in overwhelming numbers defeat superior vehicles produced in limited quantities. Trucks mechanics can repair with basic tools outperform those requiring specialized equipment and factory support.
Simplicity is its own form of sophistication. The British, who rejected the ACKWX in 1940, eventually operated thousands of CCKWs through Lend-Lease.
British drivers came to value the same traits their evaluators had criticized.
The long wheelbase, once considered cumbersome, provided stability for heavy loads.
The engine, initially deemed underpowered, proved sufficient and remarkably dependable.
The simple design meant British mechanics accustomed to complex vehicles could keep CCKWs running with whatever tools and parts were available.
The story of the GMC CCKW and the Red Ball Express is ultimately a story of what wins wars, not the most advanced technology, not the flashiest specifications, not vehicles that photograph well, but reliable equipment produced in numbers overwhelming to the enemy, operated by determined people who understand their mission.
The CCKW was not the best truck of World War II.
It was adequate, but hundreds of thousands of adequate trucks, driven by drivers willing to work until collapse, sustained the most successful military campaign in history. The humble 2.5-ton truck, dismissed by British experts in 1940, became the lifeline that supplied Allied armies from Normandy to the Elbe River. And the drivers, 75% African American, fighting for a nation that still denied them civil rights, proved that excellence knows no racial boundaries. They kept the trucks rolling when any pause could have left American soldiers without ammunition or fuel. They drove through exhaustion, fear, and discrimination because the mission mattered more than personal comfort or recognition. They returned home to a country that had yet to fully acknowledge their humanity. They had proven that African American soldiers could handle complex, critical missions under the harshest conditions. They had shown that segregation was false, that skill and determination have nothing to do with skin color. The Red Ball Express became part of the evidence that eventually helped dismantle Jim Crow segregation.
On August 25, 1944, Sergeant William Henderson tightened the last bolt on a CCKW engine and watched the truck join the convoy.
The British had called these trucks worthless.
Henderson knew better.
In the next 82 days, these supposedly inadequate vehicles would make history not through dramatic combat or technological superiority, but through simple, stubborn, unglamorous work, hauling supplies, keeping armies moving, winning the war. The GMC CCKW, the Jimmy, the Deuce and a Half, the truck rejected by the British, became America's secret weapon, the lifeline of the Red Ball Express. Proof that sometimes the most valuable things are the simplest ones, operated by people determined to get the job done no matter what.